research professor here at the Institute for International Science and Technology Policy here in the Elliott School. And it's my great pleasure to be able to moderate this panel that we have for you this afternoon. I'm going to really just restrict my remarks to some administrative things and then turn it over to the panel. Let me just say that we're streaming live, and then the video will be available online. If you could just put your phones on silence or buzzer, more than happy if you'd like to tweet about this, that's great. We are here this afternoon to get a glimpse into some of the research that our researchers at SIPRI, the Stockholm Institute for Peace Research, have done on nuclear security in the Black Sea region, and it's a really interesting topic for a lot of different reasons, contested spaces and material missing and everything that has been going on in the Ukraine. So I'm really excited to host this for our friends. Just briefly, Ian Anthony is a senior researcher and director of the European Security Program at SIPRI. And those of you in the field are very familiar with all his publications that span non-proliferation and arms control, counter-proliferation, and illicit trafficking. And he is co-author with Vitaly Fyodchenko, who's a senior researcher at SIPRI, also in the European Security Program. And Vitaly is an expert in, he's a physicist by training, if I recall, an expert in nuclear security, nuclear forensics, and measures to combat illicit trafficking. And they are joined by Vadim Ivko, who is from the Ukraine. He graduated in 2001 from the Border Guard Academy, and he has spent 23 years in service at the border. He manages international assistance projects, and he's responsible for development cooperation with U.S. agencies such as the Department of Defense, Department of Energy, State Department, as well as those with the European Union. So I would like to turn the microphone over to Ian Anthony, who will give us a little bit of background about the project and get us started.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Sharon, and thank you for the opportunity. We're really grateful that you were able to help us put together this event, and we're very happy to be here, so thank you again for everything you've done. Before talking about the project, I'm not sure how familiar people are actually with SIPRI, so I thought I'd say a couple of words just about what SIPRI is, who we are and what we do and why we do it. SIPRI is the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. So our status is, legal status is an independent foundation. We're not part of the Swedish government. That's why we're the Stockholm Institute rather than the Swedish Institute. We're an international foundation. Happens to be located in Sweden. But that's not an accident. The Institute was actually founded in the 1960s, and it was originally a commemoration of 150 years since Sweden was involved in any major armed conflict. And we had our 50th anniversary a couple of years ago, so now it would be more than 200 years since Sweden was involved in any major armed conflict. So the Parliament was essentially looking at what they would do as a commemoration. Should they put up a statue or declare a public holiday? And what they actually did was found this institute. So our mandate is to conduct research into a very broad range of issues which are connected to international peace and security. We have a very international staff. But one of the things which has been a sort of red thread, I would say, through the Institute's history has been a focus on the relationship between technology and international security. And we've always had a strong interest in nuclear-related issues ever since the Institute was created. So that's what we do and who we are. This particular project has its origins, I would say, in the events that took place in 2014 in Ukraine. But we had a pretty good baseline of nuclear security issues in the Black Sea region because we participated in a project which had finished actually in 2013, which had been examining these issues because the Black Sea region has always had, I would say, a lot of attention placed on it when it comes to nuclear security related issues. That's true if you go back to the end of the Cold War, when the principal discussion was around the management of post-Soviet problems, movement of nuclear weapons, looking at the management of the consequences of breaking up what was a fully integrated nuclear fuel cycle in the Soviet Union. Then in the 2000s, concern about mass impact terrorism and the fact that some of the most serious trafficking cases emanated from countries in the Black Sea region. So the region was always in focus, and when 2014 happened, we thought it would be important to see what the impact of that might be on the regional security environment with a specific focus on nuclear security challenges. Now that doesn't only mean because of the conflict in Ukraine, of course that was a very critical element, but also the fact that after 2014 we had regrettably a significant increase in both the number of major terrorist incidents in Europe and also the intensity of those terrorist incidents with much higher levels of lethality. So the combination of the general concern about an increasing tendency for mass impact terrorism and some of the specific issues which were relevant in the Black Sea region made us want to do this project. It's been an extremely interesting project. We could only have carried it out with a lot of partners. It's sponsored by the Carnegie Corporation of New York, so of course we were very grateful for their understanding of the need for the project and for their financial support. Without that, we wouldn't have been able to do this. But we also had two very important partners in the region, one in Romania and one in Ukraine, again, without whom we wouldn't have been able to complete the project. In terms of the method, we had enough resources that we could make a significant number of field trips and visits to the region. So we talked over the course of about 12 months to a very large number of stakeholders in and around the region, in all of the littoral countries apart from Turkey, where we never had access really, and also to many of the key external stakeholders, including here in Washington, where people were generous enough to give us their time to talk about how they saw the unfolding developments and the impact on nuclear security. So we were able to gather through interviews, I think, quite a lot of interesting primary material, which gave us a really contemporary insight into the way people were thinking in the countries of the Black Sea region about the problems they were facing. So that's really what we want to introduce to you today, what came out of that project and the insights. And we're going to organize the presentations, which won't be too long, really around three topics which seem to us to be the key issues. The first is Ukraine itself, which has a very specific set of challenges and problems, certainly exacerbated and created by what happened in 2014 and the aftermath. And that's something which Vadim is going to talk about. Then also one of the problems that's been certainly a serious issue in Ukraine is this contested space in the eastern part of the country where there's no effective administrative control. But that's actually a Ukraine problem, but not a problem that's limited to Ukraine. There are other places in the region that have a similar problem of contested spaces, so say a few words about that. And then also talk about the way in which what's happened has impacted on international cooperation, particularly in the region, and some thoughts on what would be logical next steps. And that's something which Vitaly will talk about. So with that, perhaps we move to the first presentation. Vadim? Yes, from Poland.
Cohen from Administration of the State Border Guard Service of Ukraine, and I will give you a presentation on the topic which is nuclear security in the hybrid warfare. I would like to explain why I chosen this item. First of all, nuclear security in the presentation which I will give you will refer to the security which our service and our country provides to prevent whatever radioactive or nuclear materials proliferation and being out of control, but not the nuclear security in terms of physics and other things. The hybrid warfare, definitely this is the major challenge and the major threat which my country faces, and it reflects on every sphere, including the non-proliferation and border security sphere. That is why it's throughout my presentation it will be the main topic which appear. So few information about Ukraine. We are situated, my country situated in the eastern part of Europe, and we border with 7 countries. 4 of them are the member states of the European Union on our west, which then we have very good relations, cooperation. Apparently, starting from 2014, when we signed the European Union Association Agreement, we are fostering this cooperation and developing the good relations. To these countries, we also include Republic of Moldova, which we have also the border of more than 1,000 kilometers. That country also has a European Union Association Agreement, so we are going in parallel into adjusting our relations and our activities to the European Union countries. To the north, we have Republic of Belarus. Given like short description about the relations on the operational level is very good, but when it go up on the political strategic level, it happens. That might happen everything. And to the east, unfortunately, we have the largest segment of the border with Russian Federation, which actually causes the main threat to what we have now. From the map, you can see that we have temporary occupied territories, that is Autonomous Republic of Crimea, marked red, and we also have the temporary occupied territories at some regions of Donetsk and Lugansk Oblast, which doesn't allow us to provide full control over more than 400 kilometers of the land border. Besides, we have tensions, and the tensions increases in the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea, also caused by the aggressive politics of the Russian Federation. These are a few slides which show a few pictures which were taken in 2014. Then the very serious attacks happened in the Lugansk and Donetsk Oblast. Here in this slide you can see the headquarters of our bodyguard detachment, which was situated in Lugansk city, and it was completely ruined by pro-Russian forces, so-called separatists, with full support of Russian military people. Because of that, we have lost a lot of territories, we've lost a lot of resources, assets, and the reason which can come out of not the reason, the lessons learned why we have had such situation might be the following. So, first of all, that was the transparency of our eastern border. For many years, we had like the border delimited between Ukraine and Russia, but no demarcation started. And in 2014, we realized why, because it was very easy for Russian people or Russian support organizations and people come through the undemarcated border and be present at the occupied territories. Then total demilitarization of the bodyguard service. As of now, we are partially law enforcement, partially military, paramilitary organization, because we conduct duties in the west and in the east. That time we were transforming into purely law enforcement agency with no, as you can see, no collective weapon, no armored vehicles, all other things, which influenced a lot on at the very first days when the aggression happens. And actually, which is very crucial as of now, there were no effective plans of on border covering in the state of crisis. Because of that, we have established the so-called administrative lines at the close to the temporary occupied territories, and the bodyguard service units are also deployed in that, together with National Guard and the Ukrainian Army. And the tasks of our units are the following. Mainly, we are conducting checks at the entry points for exit and entry control points and control posts. The reason for that is that we are still believe that the people who are situated at the temporary occupied territory are Ukrainian citizens, and they have the full rights to be their rights as the Ukrainian citizens have to be provided. So we organize such channels of transferring people from the temporary occupied territories to the mainland of Ukraine to receive such services if needed. Coming closer to the temporary occupied territories, first, which is very burning now, is that some regions of Donetsk and Lugansk Oblast are occupied by the pro-Russian separatists. The security line which we are standing in are about 400 kilometers, 396 kilometers, and as I told, that instability doesn't provide us to have a control over 400, more than 400 kilometers of the land border. Coming to the topic of the research done by CIPRI, from the radiological and nuclear point of view, it's also very dangerous and important because before 2014, at that territories there were present 73 enterprises of different sphere of responsibility, and according to our rosters, that enterprises were in possession of about 1,200 radioactive sources. You can see the numbers for Lugansk and Donetsk Oblast. Now we are not able, Ukraine is not able to provide like control over that sources, and that sources might be disseminated or disappeared from there, and we cannot predict where the sources can appear and what can bring, what damages can bring. To have a control over that sources, as I told, we have like checkpoints for entry and exit, and we are trying to provide their radioactive control, or so-called control over the increase of emission of radioactivity in the sources. What is peculiar about this movement? There are no like big vehicles or cargo movement for that checkpoints, only passengers and light vehicles. That allows us to provide control with the help of handheld equipment and mobile detection systems, which we received under International Technical Assistance Programs. Which is important now. We are thinking about establishing kind of redeployable assets for controlling that checkpoints for the entry and exit, and we are grateful to our colleagues from Department of Energy of the United States for supporting our idea and for providing some technical solutions for these activities. There are also some environmental protection issues which can be which should be considered as the potential threats and challenges affected by the situation which we had starting from 2014. As I told, there were many, there were many enterprises located at temporary occupied territories of Lugansk and Donetsk Oblast. Many of them were coal minings, and some of the miners previously during the Soviet time used for kind of nuclear research, and there are some mines which are now in non-operational mode, but there are records that during the Soviet time there were nuclear tests done, underground nuclear tests, and this kind of burden which we receive from the Soviet heritage. During when Ukrainian authorities there were, we were responsible for taking care about such mines because of the very high ground waters. We had to pump out this water from the ground. Unfortunately, we have received some statements from the so-called local authorities of Donetsk and Lugansk Oblasts saying that they are about to stop pumping out the water, which could bring to pollution of the waters with radioactive sources such as strontium, cesium. As the other Soviet time heritage, we have radioactive waste burial places. In total, there are 6 of them in Ukraine, and 2 of them are located now at the territories which are not under control of Ukrainian government in Donetsk and Lugansk Oblast. Fortunately enough for ourselves, we have our friends in NATO, and NATO announced a trust fund for renew and recultivation of the territories which were used for burning radioactive materials. One of the places belongs to State Bodyguard Service of Ukraine, and through the NATO Trust Fund, from during the period of 2015-2017, we managed to get out all the radioactive sources and fully recultivate the soil in that territory. Now the trust fund switched to another location which belongs to Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, Tsibolevo. But as I told, there are 2 places which are in Donetsk and Lugansk Oblast, and most likely they suffered from artillery shelling and combat operations which were conducted in that areas. But we have no true facts and exact information what happens. That is why it's also might be a point of concern and threat. On this picture you can see the building of Sevastopol Nuclear Research Institute, which also back in the times when it was not occupied by the Russian Federation, it has a research nuclear reactor with almost 300 sources of radioactive materials. Now it's under Russian control, and we cannot provide full control over the sources, which we have to do according to, as being as a member of IAEA, because Autonomous Republic of Crimea is supposed to be the part of Ukraine, and Ukraine has the sovereign rights over to perform its obligations as a member of IAEA. Given some more facts about the threats which can appear from the occupation of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea, these are the pictures which we can take from the territory for the mainland of Ukraine. This is not far from the administrative border between Ukraine and the temporary occupied territories of the Republic of Crimea. A lot of military like weaponry, techniques, people are present there, and that brings to us the very high probability of threat that they might be prepared preparing for something. You also saw in the news recently that we have now tensions in the at sea. Recently, we had very serious problems with the gas drilling rigs, which belong to Ukraine and situated at the Black Sea, but captured by Russian Federation forces, and now all of them are like moved closer to the Autonomous Republic of Crimea waters and used to drill and to pump out gas from the territories which belongs to Ukraine. And well-known tensions in the Sea of Azov and the Kerch Strait. Unfortunately, that happens so that the only maritime assets at the Sea of Azov are Ukrainian state border maritime guard, which performs its function, but unfortunately we do not have that much capacity, and the fleet which we possess is very outdated. Speaking about the threats, general threats, they are similar to every country which is situated in the world. That is illegal migration, weapon and drug contraband, commodities smuggling, and international terrorism. What is important that, as a lesson learned, which we have from the 2014, the regular routes for, let's say, contraband movement or illegal migration can be easily transferred to the routes of transferring weapons or ammunition or some other, might be radioactive sources or nuclear weapon, which is very serious. So we have to take care about that events, that issues. As regards to the radioactive protection, our service is responsible for conducting initial checks at the border crossing points, and we are more or less sophisticated and provided with necessary equipment. That is because of the high level of cooperation which we have, especially with our American colleagues from Department of Energy and Department of Defense. More than 80 border crossing points are equipped with radiation portal monitors. As I mentioned, we have also about 20 mobile detection systems. And these are the figures which we have for 11 months of 2018. We had more than 12,000 cases of detection, the increase of emission of radioactivity in the cargo. 500 cases out of them are because of medical treatment against people, and only in 10 cases we had seized more than 100 items with increased emission of radioactivity. Fortunately for us, there were no serious radioactive sources like cobalt, cesium, but still everything might happen. And I'm almost done with my presentation. I would like to give some indications on the assistance which we definitely receive to increase our capacities. First, through IAEA, Integrated Nuclear Security Support Plan, yes, which was the last revision was done in 2015 for 3 years, and now we're getting ready to revise it next year for another 3 years. Then we are actively involved in implementation of United Nations Security Council Resolution 1540. The action plan is almost adopted in our country. With European Union, we have also other relations through the program called Siberian Center of Excellences. As you know, we have Chernobyl exclusion zone, which is very important, and also apply some responsibility and bring some risks and threats to the security. I mentioned already extended programs with supported by of the United States, mainly through Department of State, Department of Energy, and Department of Defense. It's worth mentioning bilateral cooperation which we are fostering now with Norway and Sweden, and which is more important. Recently, we've introduced kind of information sharing instrument because many of our partners were complaining about providing us assistance which might be duplicated or overlapping with the assistance provided by other countries and organizations. So we have this information sharing instrument where Ukrainian authorities meet with their international and foreign counterparts and share what are the threats, what are the challenges, what are the needs, and what assistance is provided in order to avoid overlapping and duplication. Hope that I'm not hoping, I'm confident that the research done by CIPRI also will assist us in receiving more assistance and more support from the international community. That is it about my presentation. I will be happy to answer your questions if any. Thank you.
Thank you, Vadim. Perhaps we take some questions straight away.
I just noticed, let's see if I got it correctly, the plutonium, was that the Sebastopol research reactor, or was it somewhere
No,
else?
the indication was that plutonium might be at some coal mines
Coal
which
mines,
was used for
You say testing, what do you mean by
testing.
testing? Actual explosive testing?
explosive, yes. There were,
Means what?
that was back in 2008, not 2000, 1860s, where the Soviet Union had some testing, underground testing explosive, very limited number of nuclear material.
If I can interject here, Soviet Union had a peaceful nuclear explosions program,
Yes.
and this was one of those. And the idea was that at that time, in that particular mine, the Soviet Union was not. It was a mine with most amount of mine gas in the Soviet Union, and somebody had an idea that exploding a small nuclear device would provide enough cracks in the surrounding material to kind of alleviate that problem. So that was their idea for a peaceful nuclear explosive application.
So, it's like cutting down forests to plant palm
It's like
trees
fracking.
to get palm oil. I don't know if you know a good
Nuclear fracking?
fracking,
Yeah.
but anyway. How was your plutonium residue? How much plutonium was left in the month?
Well,
Living
it wasn't that much to start with, I guess, because but I guess it's all in dispersed form and it's after it's post explosion, so I don't think we're talking about
Okay, anyway.
proliferation relevant numbers, but it's more of a radiation protection issue.
It's very interesting. Thank you.
Other question? I actually have a question.
Is it okay if we do questions now?
Absolutely.
Okay. You mentioned that you had received assistance on border controls. What kind of equipment, or you said you had handheld detectors? Can you talk a little bit about the equipment that you had for?
Are you interested in
detecting?
particular type of equipment?
Well,
or-
not the serial
Again,
number,
we-
but just in general, and the.
Yes, I mentioned three agencies, DOE, DOD, and the State Department. Through State Department, we are operating mainly through EXBIS program, Export Control and Border Security. That program is very unique for us because on one hand, it can provide us assistance on export control, meaning, all the knowledge and experience on how to conduct with dual-use materials, weapon purpose materials, provide us some handheld equipment. On the other issue, it's border security, which has more broader sense than radioactive protection. Through that program, we receive like a border inspection devices. We are hosting experts from Customs and Border Protection, providing us assistance. First of all, expertise how to increase our capacity in protecting the Russian border, the border with Russia. I mentioned that now we are taking very seriously, or more seriously, the issue of providing maritime security at sea. So they brought us the permanent advisor from the United States Coast Guard, who gives us like knowledge, his expertise, and issues on reformation of our maritime system. Secondly, we had a 10th year loan program funded by DITRA, Defense Threat Reduction Agency of DoD. They also provided us a lot of assistance, starting from vehicles to the observation towers, including also handheld equipment like pagers and identifiers for radioactive protection. The pure radioactive, the pure program which increased a lot our capabilities and in providing radiation protection was second line of defense. Now it's NSDD, supported by the Department of Energy. Our cooperation started in 2005 and still ongoing, and as I mentioned, we have 80 border crossing points provided or equipped with radiation portal monitors. All of them are equipped through assistance which provided to us the Department of Energy. They also provided us handheld equipment like pagers, like handheld isotope identifiers, and we also received mobile detection systems, 20 of them, which we deploy now at the territories where we cannot use fixed RPMs. For example, at the administrative line with the Autonomous Republic of Crimea, it is not our intention to put something fixed, because Russians can say that, okay, they are putting something fixed there, so they like agree that this is the border, which is not the case. We're still hoping to regain the control over the real state border. That's it.
Thanks a lot. My name is Valeria Lozova, and I represent Odessa Center for Non-Proliferation, which actually participated in the preparation of this report. And currently I'm a visiting fellow at Center for Non-Proliferation Studies. And my question is, could you please dwell a little bit more on the cooperation with CBRN Centers of Excellence? What projects you have, and how does cooperation go?
Thank you. This initiative was launched by European Union. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it. Some back in 2010, and it focuses on the countries which are not like the EU member states, and definitely they do not include the United States, Canada, Japan, and well-being countries, so-called. The initiative is divided into regions, and Ukraine apparently comes into a region called Southeastern and Eastern Europe. There are 10 countries in that region from Western Balkan countries, which are not members of European Union. Then Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. The main idea of this initiative is first provide like expertise and the background and the knowledge and the attitude which is applicable in the EU member states, which is very valuable for us because the countries which I mentioned, apart from Armenia and Azerbaijan, have association agreement with European Union, meaning that we are moving towards approximation to European Union standards, including the standards which are applicable in the sphere of radiological and nuclear protection, safety and security. And they are like advising us very strongly to have a kind of CBRN concept for mitigation and followed by action plan, which is not still the case for Ukraine, but we know about the good example which Georgia has. They had this concept and action plan in place starting from 2015, and next year will be like the final year for application of their action plan. This is on one hand. On the other hand, they provide us a possibility to be engaged in international technical assistance projects, which are interesting for any countries in the region. Meaning, just recently this year we completed the project which was dedicated to increase our capacities in for our first responders to be able to detect and properly respond to Siberian cases, which in practice was done through conducting many exercises, both tabletop exercises and field trainings, both on national level and on regional level. This year in Georgia in summer we had kind of regional field exercise where the teams from every country played their role in playing scenarios for preventing illicit traffic and through the border of radioactive materials. Apart from that, we also received some technical assistance, equipment, pagers, protective suits. But this is not limited only in the radioactive sphere, which is like the most interesting for us. But for example, now we're thinking in the Secretariat we are speaking about launching another project which will be focused on waste management and providing like expertise and assistance to medical staffers to prepare themselves to respond properly in terms of some Siberian accident happen. So it's like a broad approach which provides us possibility both to adjust our legislation to European standards and to receive assistance in the fields which we feel necessity. Thank you.
I think we might come back to the issue of centres of excellence in the third presentation, so Natalia will also have a chance to comment on that. But there are additional questions?
I was just curious what the training process would be for the guards that find these, and if they have to go through any like special training, or if it's just.
How do we respond to cases when we found something?
How do you train the officers to deal with the cases they come across?
Well, once again, we are happy to have our partners in the Department of Energy and NSA because the program which we started 10 or more than 10 years ago was not limited only with providing technical assistance, but also training our personnel. Training for the frontline officers how to behave themselves in cases of finding something illicit trafficking through the border, training for the trainers, how to train the frontline officers, trainings for the instructors, how to create the modules, how to create the curriculum to train both the frontline officers and the trainers. And the problem which we also witnessed starting from 2014, before that year, we were installing equipment manufactured in Russia, RPMs, starting from 2014. That might not be the case anymore, so we switched to American manufactured equipment, TSA, but we have still a lot of equipment which is in operational mode installed before 2014, and we managed to train our personnel how to maintain that equipment. Definitely we cannot provide the serious repair, but the maintenance and some middle level repair can be done through our personnel. Within the structure of our service, we have a training center which is situated not far from Kiev, which has a separate branch called WMD Non-Proliferation Training Center, which provides definitely such kind of trainings for frontline officers, middle level officers, as well as we conduct kind of trainings for the representatives of other agencies, not only for the guide service, to work together how to coordinate the efforts of the agencies in cases of radioactive and nuclear accidents happening at the border. This center became the member of ISSN, if I'm not mistaken, of IAEA this year. So we are trying to increase our capacity and to provide not only national trainings, national level trainings, but also be like kind of regional training center for the southeastern Europe.
Could add maybe that the impact of the conflict has been felt across the nuclear security establishment. So a rather important training facility was located in Crimea, to which Ukraine has lost access. So there's also been a need to reconstruct Technical University in Kiev, some of the services which were previously provided by facilities which are no longer possible for Ukraine to use at the moment. It's had a broad impact on the whole nuclear security architecture and infrastructure in Ukraine.
What are those facilities being used for now?
Well, because of the loss of situational awareness and access, it's impossible, I think, to be very precise. But as far as we can see, they still conduct the same activities. It's just that they're now part of the Russian establishment rather than the Ukrainian. Some staff left, some staff remained. So it's not any longer a transparent activity. And more broadly, in fact, exactly what's happened in Crimea in terms of modification and recreation of nuclear infrastructure, including for military purposes, is something we would like to have much more information about. It's not a transparent activity.
So, question either for either of you, all of those radioactive sources at the Sevastopol Nuclear Research Institute, do we have no insight into how the Russians are controlling them?
This is not the case for Ukraine. We do not have any legal information, official information where resources are now. And to add what just Ian said, we have very strong indications that Russians recovering the former Soviet Union nuclear facilities located in nuclear warfare facilities located in Crimea. And there are some information which is not like 100% sure that they even brought their 6 nuclear warheads to the Crimean it is not like confident, but still some indications are that they are doing something in Feodosia, in Sevastopol, where that former USSR nuclear military facilities located.
It would be important to say that there was nothing during our research that indicated an increased risk coming out of transfer of responsibility. I mean, Russia has a very good and thorough understanding of nuclear security, and it's entirely probable, in fact, that materials are still being looked after in a responsible way. It's just that we have no way to document that because there's no transparency around the process. We didn't find among the people that we talked to a sense that there was an increased risk, for example, of trafficking.
Which is a separate situation from the eastern part of the
Which is a different situation from the contested space in the eastern.
Correct.
Okay, perhaps that would be a good moment to move on. Actually, it's a very good segue. I just wanted to make a few remarks about these nuclear security risks and other risks in the contested spaces, what we've called contested spaces. These are all the consequences of protracted conflict across the wider Black Sea region, from Moldova, now in Ukraine, but also in Georgia, in Armenia, in Azerbaijan. So from the western part of the Black Sea to the South Caucasus, we have a significant number of these long-standing protracted conflicts. And the contested spaces from the interviews that we carried out are still a major concern because of the very negative impact they have on the population that lives in those contested spaces. In some cases, Ukraine being the most dramatic, of course, there are still very real direct threats coming from the conflict because fighting continues. But there are also indirect threats which are caused by the loss of situational awareness and loss of access to these areas. Some of those are a consequence of looting that took place during the conflict, where looters either knew what they were taking or in some cases simply took things which they thought they may be able to sell, but didn't really have any understanding of what it was exactly that they were taking from medical centers, from hospitals, from industrial plants. And those things, of course, cause different types of risk. In the case of people who are aware of what they're doing, nevertheless, you still have a loss of service. If the hospital loses all of its equipment, then it can no longer deliver the service that's required for public health reasons. And where the looters don't know what they're taking, they can also be a risk to themselves and to the public because they're not able to handle the materials in a responsible way. You also have a problem which was revealed in the interviews of a lack of confidence that the people who take control of critical infrastructure or sensitive facilities are competent to carry out the necessary maintenance, repair, and responsible running of the plant in a way which will reduce risks from hazardous materials. Then these issues which were nuclear specific also illustrate a wider problem which exists in the contested spaces. Because if you look at the information, for example, provided to the OSCE by Ukraine, there are at least 27 or 30 locations in the contested space in the eastern part of Ukraine where there are facilities that pose a serious risk to the public. But they're not all nuclear. They include the chemical industry, water treatment facilities, power plants. So all critical infrastructure is vulnerable to lack of proper management and care and maintenance. And that's a problem which all of the countries really which have these contested spaces on their territories recognize. And they find it very difficult to find remedial measures, partly because of the barrier posed by the physical danger to people who want to go into those areas where fighting is continuing. They're at risk because of being caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, vulnerable to crossfire. But then even when fighting is not taking place, there's a risk of detention, either through arrest or kidnap, which is a deterrent, of course, to people entering the regions. There are problems which come from the sensitivity of the contact between responsible authorities and the people who are in day-to-day control of contested areas, something which was already referred to by Vadim. Does contact imply recognition? That's a barrier to establishing discussions with people who don't want to be or shouldn't be recognized as the responsible authority. Who is the proper counterpart even to deal with a specific public safety issue? And an absence of trust. If you could reach an agreement, how would you be confident that it would actually be carried out and respected? There's also a certain degree of time urgency or time sensitiveness to this, because the longer a protracted conflict continues, the more the situation becomes to a certain extent normalized. Local interests become entrenched. People have a stake in maintaining whatever control they have. And this is also a barrier to remedial action. So these are problems which were flagged really in a number of the countries where interviews were carried out. But also we saw some indications that there are options which can be applied for taking remedial action, usually through the engagement of third parties. So there are specific cases, both in Abkhazia and in Transnistria, where it was possible, even in contested space, to carry out programs that reduced the risk to the public from sensitive and hazardous materials. Usually a combination of someone who can provide a political framework for dialogue, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, a body which can provide technical expertise, so the IAEA, and bodies which have the local knowledge and staff on the ground, usually the public companies and corporations who would in normal times have responsibility. So if these third parties can be organized, we've had at least 2 cases where it's been possible to successfully implement projects, either to recover material out of regulatory control in a contested space, or to carry out inventories at critical infrastructure or sensitive facilities to get a better understanding of exactly what's there, what's been lost, and what's still in place. So those are things which we think deserve more systematic attention. It would justify, I think, a specific program to try to get a better understanding of the current situation in contested spaces, the degree to which both risks to public safety and to the environment are stemming from these lack of regulatory control, and how the successful cases of taking effective action can be built on in a more systematic and sustainable way. So that was one part of the project that we carried out, which we wanted to draw attention to here. Perhaps this is a good question. Well, if there are questions.
For this part.
We can always come back at the end and collect more questions. Otherwise,
what kind of nuclear facilities are in the eastern contested region that are of concern?
They're usually industrial facilities which are using radioactive sources, or medical facilities which are using radioactive sources in health programs. So it's radioactive material rather than nuclear material, which is really the issue. It's the management of the radioactive sources. It's a critical safety and security concern, rather than a proliferation risk.
More questions? Should I move to the?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So before I get to kind of the main point of my presentation, let me recap a few things that have already been mentioned in order to provide a context in which to my presentation. As you have already heard, this is a project which is thinking about this, which have studied the impact of the crisis in and around Ukraine on the nuclear security in the Black Sea region. And in the beginning, we have made one big assumption. We thought that this crisis must have been so big that it must have affected seriously nuclear security threats and probably nuclear security regimes in the whole Black Sea region. What we found when we did the research was a bit more nuanced. So yes, definitely the impact on Ukraine itself really is enormous, and it's acute and it's ongoing. However, our interviews with nuclear security stakeholders outside of Ukraine show that those stakeholders do not actually feel the knock-on effects of crisis in and around Ukraine on nuclear security threats in their countries. Instead, they are more concerned about other things, and one of the main topics of their concern is the local contested space that they have close to their country or in their country, in the immediate neighborhood, so to speak. And the second big theme that came up during these discussions that we had and interviews that we had is that the detection infrastructure, thanks to donors, thanks for international assistance to the region, is nearly built in a lot of cases, with some exceptions, of course, which were mentioned by Vadim. So the stakeholders start talking about other things, such as national and international coordination. And therefore, the policy paper that we have published and that you can have a copy of, it's out there outside, is focused on these three main topical areas which I just mentioned and you have heard about just now from other speakers. First is nuclear security situation and assistance to Ukraine, and you have heard from Vadim about that. Second topic is these contested spaces as the main source of nuclear security threats and what to do about that. And you have heard about that from Ian just now. And finally, my task is to talk about this more forward-looking and more hopeful part of the discussions that we had, and that is the national and regional cooperation on nuclear security in the Black Sea region. So, again, to repeat, apart from Ukraine, which is obviously a special case, quite a lot has been done during the last, say, 10-15 years. And due to a long-term involvement of donors and first and foremost United States, as well as European Union and individual European countries, the most, arguably at least, capital-intensive component of the nuclear security regime, its detection infrastructure and equipment, is mostly present throughout the region. In some countries, in one country in particular, I was talking to a nuclear security official responsible for technical side of detection, and he was very blunt. He was saying, "I don't need any more equipment. I need to know how to use it. I have personnel, and things like that, but not more equipment." So an argument can be made that there is a need for a renewed focus on other elements of nuclear security regime to ensure that that infrastructure investment is useful. Our research indicates that there are at least three areas which can be addressed in that regard. national nuclear security response planning, coordination, and exercises, meaning within the country, regional coordination and joint exercises with neighbor countries where that is politically possible. And the third one is more is more complicated and looking into the future, and that is regional collaboration, especially on leveraging existing regional capabilities for joint use. So I will go through these 3 points very quickly now. So national response coordination. So International Atomic Energy Agency has these nuclear security series, which is basically a number of publications that provides guidance on how to set up and maintain and run nuclear security regimes in individual countries. And IAEA is very clear about this in its most basic guidance document that they need to define nuclear security responsibilities between agencies within an individual country, as well as conduct planning, preparedness, and actual response is a very essential, two of their very essential elements of any nuclear security regime. A more specific IAEA guidance document strongly suggests, in particular, that the states should have a comprehensive national response plan for nuclear security events. And what we have found around the region is that, yes, these plans kind of exist in different countries, but there is clearly a need for them to be improved. And improved in different ways. So, for example, they need to be formalized, meaning stakeholders have to be made aware of their, national agencies in this case, have to be made aware of their responsibilities. And surprisingly, we have seen in some countries that it's not always the case. The second thing that has to happen is that these national response planning has to be made comprehensive and cover all pertinent functions, contingencies, and stakeholders. And again, that's not always the case. Sometimes this national response planning exists, and it's fine, but it only concerns, for example, the border and nothing else. The third part is that it has to be adopted at an appropriate level, and that means that these responsibilities have to be binding. If you talk to Moldovan colleagues, they will openly tell you that they do have response plan, they call it CONOPS, concept of operations, but they themselves call it, that's their term, gentleman's agreement. It's just 4 heads of pertinent authorities got together and agreed in a non-binding manner that they're going to do this. And that's very important, this planning has to be exercised, including using unannounced exercises. And that is because if it just exists on paper, it's no use, it's no good. And the final and also very important point here is that there has to be a review done of this response planning on the basis of these exercises, and if there are cases, real cases, then on the basis of the experience coming out of those. When asked why this has not been well, improved over a number of years now, the usual response we would be getting is something having to do with a lack of political attention to the subject. That is not to say that international donors are not aware of this particular issue. United States in particular has an initiative to improve national nuclear security response planning in some countries of the region. EU did something about that as well in the past, and the IAEA has a separate service which states can request, and the IAEA would provide the assistance they can. But I guess what we could argue as a result of what we have heard in the region it seems that this particular work could be intensified. Let's put it this way. The second point I would like to make is the regional coordination in joint exercises, which is sort of an extension of the previous one. So nuclear smuggling or illicit trafficking is by definition international phenomenon. If we are talking about smuggling, then at least two countries are going to be involved. One country from where the material is lost and the other country where it's found. And maybe even more if the material went through a number of countries on the way. And because it is an international phenomenon, the case can be made for harmonizing these nuclear security response procedures that I was just talking about on a national level among neighboring countries, or at least neighboring countries where that is politically feasible. And there are good arguments, I think, to be made why that should be done. First is that if you have this if you have two countries next to each other and each of them is focusing on their national stakeholders and its nuclear security response planning, then they might end up having maybe good response plans but not compatible with each other. And if there would be a real case of nuclear smuggling between the two countries, then this incompatibility will cause delays and all sorts of issues. The second argument is that for this particular region, it's a good idea to harmonize procedures between the EU and non-EU states, is because promotion of regional cohesion and especially integration with the EU is a powerful political driver for several states in the region. And that exists everywhere, not just in nuclear security. So this driver can be harnessed for the nuclear security purposes, for the purposes of improving national nuclear security regimes. And the final point here is that international engagement itself raises awareness and at the same time contributes to sustainability of nuclear security efforts in the region, of local nuclear security efforts. Essentially, if a country, if a nuclear security activity has an international dimension, it is better known, there is more attention to it, and it's essentially harder to shut down. Then there is also another phenomenon which we have seen, and that is the general competition between neighboring states sometimes motivates them to keep pace with each other, with each other's nuclear security regime improvements. Sort of, well, if my neighbor has it, I should have it too. And then the final part and the final slide is about the idea of leveraging existing original capabilities for joint use. This is discussed in the region as well, and the arguments for there are two main arguments for it. First argument is it's basically just not practical to set up in all the countries all the same capabilities, full-scale capabilities for nuclear security. It's just too expensive and probably not necessary. The second argument is that after the end of the nuclear security summits process, countries in the region, at least some of them, reported that they feel a general decline in political attention from their own leadership to nuclear security, because unlike the time of the nuclear security summits, this issue does not get such a high level attention anymore. The heads of state don't have to go every 2 years and talk about it. So the attention is declining, and the funding probably is going to decline or already declining with it. Examples of such a cooperation exist already. some of those. There is one, for example, where Guam countries have a standing regional collaboration in nuclear forensics, and that is basically if one country finds a sample of radioactive material, it tries to analyze it by itself, and if that doesn't work, sends it to, in this case, Ukraine for a more thorough analysis, because Ukraine has more capabilities to do that. There are other examples as well. They are most often ad hoc, but there are cases where detection equipment was repaired by a neighboring state when there was no possibility to do that in state for some reason, and so on. So there is a general theoretical agreement that more cooperation is necessary within the region where it is politically feasible. And finally, and that is what Ian was mentioning, the EU has this approach of promoting national planning for further improvement of nuclear security regimes of each country. And the new idea that came from that, and that is this initiative of CBRN Centers of Excellence, is to see if once the nations have these plans, well, in this case they're CBRN, they're not just nuclear security, but it's still applicable. Once nations have those plans developed, it would be beneficial to see if it would be possible to harmonize these plans across neighboring countries who would be willing to do so, because then again it would allow to pool resources across countries to achieve the same goal identified in those plans. And again, it would be also a good contribution to sustainability of nuclear security, in our case, regimes, because it would provide political momentum. Like I said, there is this phenomenon in the region where countries can get energized by their own neighbors to participate in something. So this is the end of my presentation, and I would be happy to take questions if there are any.
Why don't we start at the back, move across.
This may be a bit of a digression, but I'm curious, in conducting the stakeholder interviews that were involved in the process of publishing this report, did you at all touch on the issue of insider threat in nuclear facilities? And if so, has the developing situation in contested territories affected the perception of insider threat as a source of risk?
Well, I think this is to Vadim and to Ian.
If you want to say something first, but the short answer is yes. Ukraine after 2014 made a very thorough assessment of security risk across the board, including nuclear security risk, and took some very specific measures in response, including revision of the design-based threat for nuclear facilities, the creation of effectively a new state authority, National Guard, with specific responsibility for security of nuclear facilities. And I would say also a transformation of the conceptual framework, which previously was largely based on international cooperation, including Russia, to a threat assessment which took into account Russia as a risk. So yes, there was a rather thorough re-evaluation of all aspects of nuclear security risk, including cyber dimensions.
Actually, you answered very thoroughly what I just wanted to say. We did the lesson learned, and from what happened in 2014, we realized that we have to, as Ian said, reconsider nature of that threats. Because at the very beginning, in the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and in Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast, the threat appeared from inside. There were no threat coming from outside, from the border. Something happened inside that areas, and then it was supported by Russia, and then, I would say, invasion happened. So all the threats now are reconsidered, and as I mentioned in my presentation, we're also that time lacked of national plans, response plans. Now it's been not the case anymore. We started from the very strategical documents, coming down to the national response plans and the agency response plans, taking into account first the insider threat rather than the threat coming from outside.
Vitali, I was wondering if you've investigated possible misuse of machine radioactive sources, like small portable neutron generators that are used in well logging or other types of depth measuring and sensing applications, or even small portable X-ray units that can deliver very large doses of radiations in a short period of time.
Well, not as such. I don't know if Vadim has something to say. We did not come across that particular question in our work. There was one UN official who made a point, with the knowledge of this situation, who made a point to us that there are plutonium and beryllium sources which apparently show up in ITDB reporting, which merit specific attention because some of them actually have serious, I think it's up to tens of grams of plutonium, yeah. Or probably even more. Okay, you're aware of those. So in terms of specifics, if you're talking, that was probably something that came up.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. You mentioned a scenario where there's competition between countries to make sure that their nuclear security is as good as their neighbors. Can you talk a little bit about a specific example or two where that happened?
I would rather not name countries because when I was in one of those countries and let's say it's Caucasus, I'm confident that there is a dimension of that kind because we have heard it from different. But when I actually asked these people themselves about it, they were not particularly amused. But yes, I would say there is this effect. It can be debated, of course, if this effect is strong enough to base any policies on this, but probably not. But that's what we have heard. There is sort of a group effect. Nobody wants to be an outsider. And actually, this is an important point because even branding is important. So I mentioned the Guam initiative, regional collaboration in nuclear forensics. And when you ask about it, when you talk about it with national stakeholders in different countries, most of the time do you hear something positive. But then, again, in one of the countries, we have heard that Ukraine was labeled as somebody from outside of the region said, well, Ukraine is obvious regional leader in this network. And that was meant as a praise, and that was meant as a positive comment. But then
in the Caucasus, they look at it and say, okay, so if Ukraine is a leader, what does it make us? And there is, I understand that this is a strange sentiment, maybe it's not so strange, but it exists. And I think if the policies towards the region are constructed carefully, this could be harnessed for improvement of nuclear security as well.
Thanks a lot for your presentation. It was really interesting to listen to your points. And my question is, do you think the lack of attention to nuclear security and national response coordination matters is related to the fact that there are more relevant, more urgent security threats, or to the fact that nuclear security is, say, not spoken of enough to the ears of authorities? Thank you so much.
I don't know, but I think it's all of the above. In a way, you're better equipped to address that question than we are, but I would say, just based on the discussions in Ukraine, it's clear that the entire country is going through such a fundamental process of transformation and reform, that so many problems are having to be addressed simultaneously, that sustaining resources and interest is a challenge for pretty much every functional area. I mean, linking it back to the question earlier about modified approaches to threat assessment, after all of those changes were made, then comes the issue of implementation. And there, the struggle for resources was very clear in the discussions that those facilities which now are obliged to put in place new security measures will have to be inspected to make sure that they've actually done it. And the authority has, I think, 2 inspectors. So it's going to take a very, very long time to inspect each facility, and the interval between inspections will be very long. So it's a resource issue. Of course, if there were more inspectors, it would be possible to do this in a more systematic way, or at least a quicker way. But that's the authority finding it hard to fight for resources in conditions where Ukraine is trying to do so many things at once.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Paul Walker from Green Cross. Great to see you all, and thanks for the good presentations, and thanks Sharon for facilitating here. I had a question on the recent incidents in the Azov Sea. If it comes about that Russia in fact does successfully prevent the Ukraine and/or the United States and NATO allies from sailing into the Azov Sea, to what extent would that really have an impact on nuclear security, do you think, in the region? Or maybe it wouldn't make any difference. It certainly, I would think, would have an impact on your marine assets in the border and customs patrol area. And I had a second question too. This is really for all of you as well. To what extent, if you could speak frankly, have the IAEA and the OSCE been helpful in all the needs around nuclear security? I mean, they're inspectors and there are safeguard issues, but to what extent do you think they've been helpful in a variety of ways and helped to meet your needs, helped to meet the needs in the Black Sea area for nuclear security? Thank you.
Well, speaking about the maritime issue, right? The main threat would be both, or not, the main consequences will be posed on trade first, because these are the main routes from seaports of Ukraine, Mariupol, Berdyansk, going from that area to the rest of the world, And these two ports are the main ports because of the industry and some agriculture stuff going from that ports. By that time, we didn't have any serious issues related to radioactive security, radiological security at that port. So definitely we had some cases of increased radioactive emission, but not serious. That is why I wouldn't say we would have any serious changes in radioactive security. Rather than block put by Russians on that area would give them possibility to go further. And I wouldn't say there are a lot of scenarios, but one of the scenario is having like the land route from Russia to Crimea by the seashore of Azov. That would affect definitely on the security in general and maybe some non-proliferation security in particular. But that's all theoretical speculations, and we don't know what would happen. Speaking about the assistance which we receive from IAEA and OSCE, I would say some comments. IAEA is very helpful in assisting us through this, as I mentioned, integrated nuclear
INSSP,
Right.
International Integrated Nuclear Security Plan.
Nuclear Security Support Plan,
Support
right,
plan.
which was revised previously in 2015, and next revision will be done next year. That brings us, like answering to the question, to the previous question, gives us another leverage on the government of Ukraine to pay more attention to nuclear security in particular, because being as a member of IAEA, we have certain obligations and we have to report on what was done. And the inspectors coming to Ukraine do not only help us in revision of the document, but also inspect the progress which Ukraine has in implementation of this plan. OSCE is the only instrument how can we get information on what is happening at the occupied territories of Donetsk and Lugansk Oblast. Unfortunately, its mandate only limited with the clash line, the separation line between Ukraine and pro-Russian separatists, and there are two missions located at Russian border crossing points, which are at that segment of Ukrainian border which is not controlled by the Ukrainian authorities in Donetsk, city of Donetsk, and I do not remember the other border crossing point, which that missions provides a report to OSCE Secretariat, which shares with any member states, and we have some indications of I wouldn't say undeclared cargo moving from Russian territory to the temporary occupied territories of Lugansk and Donetsk Oblast. So there are some good news and good instruments which is provided by OSCE SMM, Special Monitoring Mission, but still there are rooms for improvement.
Can I comment?
Of course.
In terms of how the IAEA safeguards are applied on the occupied territories. So currently, the IAEA applies a state-level approach to Ukraine, and so they publish their safeguards implementation report and give the safeguards conclusion for Ukraine based on generally assessing the safeguard situation in the country. So according to this, they do not have to inspect every single facility in the country. So basically, it gives them some leeway to escape, challenging situations, because if on the one hand, Russia is under voluntary offer agreement, so basically the IAEA inspectors can be able to go to this facility unless it's registered as the one that should be inspected. So actually, state level approach helped the IAEA to, somehow cope with this challenging situation. So basically, in general, what people say on the sidelines of different meetings is that we're pretty confident that Russia keeps the facility secure and safe and it doesn't really need it. So that's what they say. Thank you.
Just an observation on the OSCE. As was already mentioned, the Special Monitoring Mission has already played a role in the sense that it was through them that it was possible to map environmental challenges in contested space. So without the SMM, that mapping wouldn't have been carried out at all. But I think the OSCE also has other possibilities which probably haven't been fully explored because they're not necessarily directly linked to nuclear security issues. But for example, in the area of environmental confidence building, they do have some capacities and some experience of looking at issues of how to manage hazardous waste. So by looking at other parts of the OSCE and combining it with what's already been done through the SMM, you could have a platform to build on, really, to do something a bit more systematic. So I would tend to see it as a very useful contribution that can be built on, especially if functional links can be created with other stakeholders, including in the areas themselves. As I was saying, the role of the public corporations who actually have people on the ground who understand the situation, who are competent to deal with it, is also a very important player in this. So it's a sort of joining the dots exercise. I think that the capacities are probably there, but they could be linked together more effectively.
I have a microphone up here. Do you mind if I ask a question? Of course. So I get the point about, gee, we have enough equipment. Now we need training or development of nuclear security culture. But what I'm wondering is there any technology that, had it been implemented before the Russians moved in, would it have been helpful? And in particular, I'm thinking about, I think the Koreans had some kind of technology for radioactive sources. Paul, maybe you remember it. I can't remember whether it was just like barcoding or whether there was actually GPS tracking. But they had a system that they, I didn't see it, but I thought they unveiled this at the 2012 Nuclear Security Summit. It was a way of keeping track, so you wouldn't have orphaned radioactive sources. And so, hindsight's always 20/20, but can you think of anything or that might have helped, keep some of this material in some kind of control? I mean, we can all say that, gee, the Russians are probably taking care of it, but they're not very transparent. And whether it's nuclear security, physical protection related measures, or safeguards, there's not a lot of information out there. So maybe the answer is nothing, but I thought I'd pose the question.
Well, I think probably knows a little better, but if I can comment. I vaguely remember that the technology you're talking about did involve some GPS tracking. And okay, in the ideal world, if every source in Ukraine would have been equipped with that, maybe it would, yeah, sure, of course it would have been good. But I think at least what I have understood from the eastern part of Ukraine and the situation there is that a lot of issues there are a lot more basic than that. And there are a lot of remnants of the Soviet legacy, which probably weren't even explored or found. Because
So again, maybe Vadim can correct me if I'm misunderstanding this, but it's one thing to know about sources that are in civilian cycle, civilian sources. Then there is a whole military. I'm not talking about weapons. I'm talking about military handling radioactive sources. And Soviet military definitely did that as well. And with the Soviet Union, breaking up and the Soviet military going back and so on and so forth, I think we have seen indications that there were things left behind which even, or maybe that even Ukraine government didn't quite know about. At least we had at least one case where that was specifically we were told about. So talking about radioactive sources, each single one marked with a GPS, yeah, great. But there are
solve the bigger problems.
there are a lot more basic things to do. Things like mobile laboratories, or even access to the eastern part of Ukraine. Yeah, so there are more basic things.
Other questions? Are there any other final concluding thoughts that any of you would like to share?
I need to thank you again for the opportunity, and thank you for being so engaged and willing to spend the time with us.
Thank you. So we have copies of the report outside. It's also available, I think, online. Is it? On the SIPRI website. And there's still food in the back, including Christmas